This video is sponsored by Taskade, a real-time organization and collaboration platform. Make sure to check the description for a discount on your subscription. Hey everyone, my name is Vishwas and welcome to this crash course on CSS Grid for complete beginners. In this crash course, we will understand the various concepts that CSS Grid has to offer. Before we begin, let me go over a few points. First, I would like to mention this course is for complete beginners. If you're someone who is new to CSS Grid or have an idea about CSS Grid and want to understand better, please continue. If you're an expert, this is your cue to probably hop into another video where your time can be better utilized. Second, this video is a continuation of the CSS and Flexbox crash courses. Make sure you're familiar with both HTML and CSS before proceeding. Flexbox is not a prerequisite, but if you've understood Flexbox, learning CSS Grid becomes relatively easier. Also, make sure you code along with me, as that is the best way to learn. By the end of this video, you will have a solid understanding of creating layouts with CSS Grid. Alright, with these points in mind, let's get started. What is CSS Grid? The CSS Grid layout module, or simply known as CSS Grid or just Grid, is a two-dimensional grid-based layout system. With rows and columns, Grid makes it easier to design web page layouts, align, and distribute space among items in a grid. Flexbox is great when we are dealing with one-dimensional layouts. But when dealing with two-dimensional layouts, and you're concerned about laying down elements both horizontally and vertically, CSS Grid makes the task so much easier, including the complex layouts that we typically tend to struggle with. If you're comfortable with HTML, CSS, and Flexbox, CSS Grid is the logical next step for you. Alright, now that we understand the what and why of CSS Grid, let's dive into understanding the different concepts. We first need to start off by understanding the terminology in CSS Grid. Trust me when I say this, the next few minutes you spend understanding what each term means will decide how easy it is to understand the different properties CSS Grid offers. Understanding the terminology is essential to this course, so please make sure you pay attention. When we talk about CSS Grid, we mainly have two entities: a parent container, which we term as the grid container, and the immediate children elements, which we term as grid items. If you look at the sample HTML, the parent div is the grid container, and all the children divs are the grid items. Very important to keep this in mind. The next term to make note of is grid line, which is the horizontal or vertical dividing line in a grid. The orange line is an example of a column grid line, as it is a vertical line. If it is horizontal, it is called a row grid line. Next, we have a grid cell, which is the smallest unit you can have on your CSS grid. It is the space between four intersecting grid lines, as you can see here denoted by the orange square. Next, we have a grid track, which is the space between two adjacent grid lines. It is denoted by the green portion on the screen. Finally, we have grid area, which is the total space surrounded by four grid lines. A grid area may be composed of any number of grid cells. Now, these terms you don't have to memorize for the very first time. However, it does help when learning the different properties. But what is very important from the beginning is to understand grid container and grid items. Understanding CSS Grid is basically getting familiar with the properties associated with the grid container and the grid items, knowing what properties exist and how they work. You can always refer to the documentation if you're having trouble building a particular layout. With the terminology now familiar, let's begin by focusing first on the properties that are associated with just grid container. There are 18 properties in total, of which we're going to learn 16 in this crash course. The other two, I would say, they might be a bit confusing from a beginner's point of view. My recommendation is to understand the 16 properties and then have a look at the other two, which I will mention later on in the course. First, we have the display property. This is what defines a grid container and is mandatory to work with CSS Grid. Next, we have the grid template column and row properties to set the number of columns and rows in the grid. We then have column and row gap properties to set the gap between columns and rows. Next, we have justify, align, and place items properties, which are concerned with alignment of the grid items. Similarly, we have content alignment properties, which deal with alignment of the entire grid. Finally, we have properties to deal with auto-generated grid tracks. Now, this is just a list of the different properties, so don't get overwhelmed as to how each of them work. We will dive into each of them and understand how they work with a visual example in the browser. To get us started with CSS Grid, I have set up some very simple HTML and CSS that I am now going to walk you through. I have created a folder called Grid Crash Course, and within the folder, I've created an index.html file and a styles.css file. The HTML is pretty standard. The head tag contains what you would normally find and a link to the CSS file. Within the body, we have a parent div tag with a class called container. This parent container has 9 div tags as children, and each div has a class grid item and also a class specific to the item number. Item 1, 2 till 9. In the CSS file, I've set margin to 0 on the body element, and on the container class, I've added a thick black border. On the grid item class, I've added a font color white, a font size of 1.5 rem, 1 rem padding, and I've also centered aligned the text. For items 1 through 9, I've set a different background color so as to visually separate each item in the browser. The HTML and CSS code can be found on my GitHub page in the Crash Courses 2022 repo. You can either clone, copy, or download the code. If you open the HTML file in the browser, you should be able to see this layout. You can see that we have 9 items enclosed within a container that has a solid black border. Now let's focus on our very first grid container property, which is the display property. To create a grid container, we make use of the display property and set it to a value of grid. In the CSS file, on the container class, add the property display and set it to grid. If we save this file and refresh the browser, you won't see any difference to how the content is displayed, as display grid has created a single column grid for the items. So when creating a grid container, all of the contained grid items are placed in rows by default and span the full width of the grid container. So it does behave similar to a block level element. If you do not want a block level grid container, you can set the display property to inline grid and create an inline grid container. In the CSS file, display is going to be inline grid. Save the file, refresh. You can see the border now wraps around the grid items. The container only takes up width to accommodate its children, which is in this case the text in each of the items. So the display property is used to create either a block level or inline level grid container. The possible values are grid and inline grid. Now, if you want to explicitly set a grid by creating columns and rows, you need to make use of grid template columns and grid template rows property. Let's understand each of them. First, let's take a look at defining columns. I'm going to revert display to grid and then set a new property called grid template columns. And this property specifies the number of columns in a grid layout. The values are a space-separated list where each value specifies the size of the respective column. For example, we can set the value as 100 pixels, 200 pixels, and 300 pixels. This will create 3 columns in the grid. The first column width is 100 pixels, second column width is 200 pixels, and third column width is 300 pixels. If we head to the browser and refresh, you can see we now have 3 columns of varying size. Item 1 is 100 pixels, item 2 is 200 pixels, and item 3 is 300 pixels. But since we have specified the grid should have only 3 columns, the fourth item is now pushed to the second row. So items 4, 5, 6 now have the same size as 1, 2, and 3. Similar is the case with items 7, 8, and 9. The grid container is still the entire width of the browser. However, the items only take up 600 pixels in width. Now, if you want equal width columns, simply set 200 pixels 3 times. So 200, 200, and 200. Refresh, and all are equal width columns. Now, sometimes you might want to specify equal width columns, but for a greater number of columns. In such a scenario, you can use the repeat function. So instead of 200 pixels 3 times, you can specify the value as repeat 3 times 200 pixels. Refresh, and the result is the same. But now we can change 3 to 6, and we can easily have 6 equal width columns. Refresh. You can see we have the first 6 items in row 1, 7, 8, 9 in row 2. And this is because we have specified 6 columns of equal width. Now, it is also possible to set the width of the column as a fraction of the available free space in the container. For example, we can set grid template columns value to 1 FR, 2 FR, and 1 FR again. So if you were to have 100% width, columns 1 and 3 are given 25% of the space, while column 2 is given 50% of the space. Refresh, and you can see just that. We have specified the width as a fraction of the available space. Another function that is useful with grid is the min-max function. We can specify 3 columns, so repeat 3 columns whose width should be min-max 200 pixels, comma 1 fraction. So the column should be at least 200 pixels, but can grow to take up the free space if available. When I refresh, you can see we have 3 columns. We can reduce the browser width and the columns start to shrink. But at 200 pixels, they stop shrinking and simply overflow. These are some of the values we can specify. So the grid template columns property is used to specify the number of columns in the grid. The width can be any non-negative length value like pixels, percentage, etc., or as a fraction of the free space available. You can also make use of functions like repeat and min-max to achieve the perfect grid layout. On a side note, this property also accepts a line name as part of the value, but I feel it to be confusing for a beginner, so I've decided to leave that out. Alright, the next property we're going to understand is grid template rows, which specifies the number of rows in a grid. The value you can specify is pretty much what you can specify for grid template columns. However, you're now setting the height of the row instead of the width. So we can set grid template rows 100 pixels, and this sets the height of the first row to 100 pixels. You can see item 1, 2, and 3 have 100 pixels as height. I can set the value as 100 pixels, 150 pixels, 200 pixels, refresh, and we see 3 rows of different heights: 100, 150, and 200. Specify repeat 3 times 100 pixels, and we have 3 rows of equal height. Now if you specify a 4th row, so repeat 3 times and then 200 pixels as the 4th value, refresh, you can see a blank row at the end. It doesn't contain any items, but the space is occupied by the grid container. Now you can also use the fraction unit if the container has a defined height. Let's add height of 400 pixels and grid template rows as repeat 1 fraction 3 times. Refresh, and you can see the 3 rows grow to take up the available free space in the container. Pretty straightforward, as you can see. So the grid template rows property is used to specify the number of rows in the grid. The height can be any non-negative length value like pixels, percentage, etc., or as a fraction of the free space available. You can also make use of functions like repeat and min-max. This property also accepts a line name as part of the value, which I'm going to leave out as it is not significant from a beginner's perspective. The third property is grid template, which is a shorthand for defining rows and columns. So instead of grid template rows and grid template columns, I'm going to add grid template, and the value is going to be the value of the rows. So repeat 3 times 1 fraction, followed by a /, followed by the value of columns. So repeat 3 times min-max of 200 pixels or 1 fraction. When I refresh, you can see there is no change in the layout. So the grid template property is used to specify both rows and columns in the grid. Its value is the value of grid template rows followed by a / and then grid template columns. Alright, let's now move on to the next set of properties which deal with spacing between rows and columns. First, we have the column gap property, which sets the gap between the columns in the grid. For example, if we set column gap to 20 pixels and refresh, we can see a gap of 20 pixels between the columns. Similarly, we can also set the gap between rows. The property is row gap, and we can set this to 30 pixels. Refresh, and we now see spacing between the rows as well. Now you can specify both column and row gap using just the shorthand gap property. So let's comment column gap, row gap, and instead specify gap 40 pixels and 20 pixels. Here, the first value is row gap and the second value is column gap. When I refresh, you can see 40 pixels between the rows and 20 pixels between the columns. So to specify gap between columns, you can use the column gap property. To specify gap between rows, you can use the row gap property. And you can also use the shorthand gap property to specify both row gap and column gap. Values can be any non-negative value or a percentage. Let's now move on to the next set of properties, which are concerned with alignment. And there are two types of alignment properties: within the grid cell and within the grid container. Let's first take a look at alignment within the cell. To align the grid items along the row axis, we can make use of the justify items property. On the grid container class, I'm going to comment out the grid gap as we don't need that anymore. Now I'm going to add a new property called justify items, and by default the value of this property is stretch. If I set stretch as a value and refresh, you can see there is no change apart from the gap being removed. However, if I set a value of start, refresh, you can see that all the items are aligned to the start edge of their cell. This will be more clear when we inspect the element and hover on the grid container. You can see that the items are pushed to the start of the individual cells. And we can also set a value of end, in which case the items are pushed to the end of the cell. Finally, we can also set center, in which case the item is horizontally center aligned within the cell. So justify items for alignment along the row axis. If you want to adjust alignment along the column axis, there is the align items property. Similar to justify items, align items has a default value of stretch. If I refresh, there is no change in the grid layout. However, if I set the value to start, refresh, you can see all the items are pushed to the top of the cell. Set it to end, and all the items are pushed to the bottom of the cell. Set it to center, and all the items are vertically center aligned within the cell. So align items for alignment along the column axis. Now it is also possible to specify both the properties in a single declaration using the place items property. So I can comment out justify items, align items, and instead specify place items, and let the value be start and end. The first value here, which is start, is for align items, and the second value is for justify items. So if you've got this right, the items should be pushed to the top of the cell and then to the right of the cell. Refresh, and we see just that. Place items can also accept a single value, in which case the same value is assigned to both align items and justify items. Let's set one value of center. Now when I refresh, you can see the item is center aligned both horizontally and vertically within the cell. So for alignment and spacing within the cell, you have justify items for variation along the row axis, align items for variation along the column axis, and place items, which is a shorthand for both. The possible values are start, end, center, and stretch, which is the default value. Alright, let's now take a look at the second set of alignment properties, which deal with alignment within the container. Now to understand the different properties, we have to make a small change in the grid template value. We're going to create a grid with 3 rows 200 pixels tall and 3 columns 200 pixels wide. So repeat 3, 200 pixels and repeat 3, 200 pixels. I'm going to set height to 800 pixels and comment out the place items property. If we take a look at the browser, refresh, you can see the grid container with the black border, but the 3x3 grid itself is smaller. This extra space gives you an opportunity to align the entire 3x3 grid block within the container. Now to align the content along the row axis, we have the justify content property. By default, the value is set to start. So if I specify justify content start, refresh, you can see there is no change in the layout. If I set it to end and refresh, the content is now moved to the end of the row axis. Set it to center, and the content is now center aligned with respect to the container. Horizontally, of course. Now Grid also provides additional values that can control how the extra space has to be distributed within the container. First, we have a value of space between. When I refresh the browser, you can see the extra space that was left out is evenly split and added in between the grid columns. Sometimes you might also want the space before the first column and after the last column. For such a scenario, the value is space around. Let me change the value and refresh the browser. You can see there is now space at the beginning and at the end. And the space is equal to half of the space between the grid columns. For example, if the space in between the columns is 200 pixels, space at the start and the end would be 100 pixels. However, if you want the same space at the start and the end of the items as well, the value you're looking for is space evenly. So justify content, space evenly. If I refresh, you can see the extra space equally distributed within the container. Of course, we can expect the same behavior along the column axis as well. Grid provides another property called align content. The values are the same as justify content, so I'm going to go over this fairly quicker. First, we have start, which is also the default value. This pushes the content to the top of the container. Refresh, and you can see there is no change as it is the default value. Specify end, and it pushes the content to the bottom of the container. Center, refresh, and the content is now center aligned vertically. To control spacing, we have space between, in which case the space is evenly distributed between the rows. You can also specify space around, which adds space at the top and at the bottom. The space is equal to half of the space between the rows. If you want the same space at the top and bottom of the rows as well, the value is space evenly. Refresh, and you can see the extra space is equally distributed within the container. Now the next property is place content, which is a shorthand for align content and justify content. So place content, start, end, and comment out the other two properties. Here, the first value of start is for align content, and the second value of end is for justify content. If you've understood this right, the content should be pushed to the top of the container and then to the right of the container. Refresh, and we see just that. Now place content can also accept a single value, in which case the same value is assigned to both align content and justify content. Let's set one value of center. Now when I refresh, you can see the content is center aligned both horizontally and vertically within the container. So for alignment and spacing within the container, you have justify content for alignment along the row axis, align content for alignment along the column axis, and place content, which is a shorthand for both. The possible values are start, end, center, and stretch, with start being the default value. You also have space between, space around, and space evenly for adding spacing between the rows and columns. Alright, let's now move on to the last few properties that apply to a grid container. The next property to know about is grid autoflow, which controls how auto-placed items get inserted into the grid. For this property, I'm going to comment out all the properties except display grid and of course the border. If we take a look at the browser, you can see that the items are placed by filling each row. 9 rows for 9 items. This is because the default value of grid autoflow is row. So if I specify grid autoflow and set a value of row, refresh, we see no change in the browser. However, set it to column, refresh, and you can see the items being placed by filling each column. 9 columns for 9 items. The next property is grid auto columns, which is used to specify the default width of a column. Currently, we have not specified a column width. So if we were to set grid auto columns 100 pixels, refresh, you can see every column is now 100 pixels. This value, of course, will be overridden if you have specified a column width using the grid template columns property. Similar to grid auto columns, we also have grid auto rows, which sets the default height for rows within the grid. If we set it to 200 pixels, refresh, you can see the only row we have is now 200 pixels tall. So, some of the auto properties, as I call them, include grid auto flow, which controls how auto-placed items get inserted into the grid. By default, it is set to row, but you can also set it to column. 3 other values are dense, row dense, and column dense, which are applicable for more complex layouts that you can look at once you've mastered the fundamentals. You then have grid auto columns for setting the default column width and grid auto rows for setting the default row height. The value can be in pixels, percentage, min-max, etc., with auto being the default value. With that, we've had a look at all the grid container properties that I wanted to cover in this crash course. Two more properties which I would like you to read about once you're comfortable with the properties discussed so far are grid template areas and grid. Grid template areas is used to specify areas within the grid layout, and the grid property is a shorthand for grid template rows, grid template columns, grid template areas, grid auto rows, grid auto columns, and finally grid auto flow. Alright, next let's take a look at the list of properties applicable on a grid item. First, we have grid column start and grid column end. These two properties control on which column line the item starts and ends. Similarly, we have grid row start and grid row end, which control on which row line the item starts and ends. We then have grid column and grid row, which is a shorthand for the previously mentioned properties. Finally, we have justify self, align self, and place self, which deal with alignment of the item. Alright, now that we know the different properties that can be applied to a grid item, let's take a closer look at each of the properties, starting with grid column start and grid column end. I'm going to comment out all the grid container properties except display and grid template. Now, if we take a look at the browser, refresh, it is quite evident that grid items by default take up one column in the container. That can be changed using grid column start and grid column end. On item 1, I'm going to set grid column start 1 and grid column end 3. If we now take a look at the browser, refresh, you can see item 1 starts at the first line in the grid and ends at the third line in the grid. So it now takes up 2 columns worth of space. If I set it to end at 4, refresh, it takes up 3 columns. Set it to 5, and it will add a new column, and the width will be the rest of the available space. Which is why you see item 5 and 9 also take up more space than 200 pixels. Now, if you're unsure about the end column line, you can also mention how many columns it should span using the span keyword. So grid column end, let's say it has to span for 2 columns. Refresh, and you can see item 1 now spans across 2 columns. Similarly, let's take a look at the next 2 properties which deal with row lines. On item 1 again, we can set grid row start 1 and grid row end 3. If I now refresh the browser, you can see item 1 starts at the first row line and ends at the third row line, effectively taking up 2 rows of space. You can also use the span keyword. So span for 2 rows. Refresh, and the layout remains the same. It is also possible to specify these values using the grid column and grid row shorthand. So let me comment out the 4 properties and instead specify grid column is going to be 1/span2, so grid column start and grid column end. And similarly, grid row is going to be 1/span2. So again, the first value is the start value, and then a forward slash, and then the end value. Refresh, and we still see the same layout. So the grid column start, grid column end, grid row start, and grid row end properties control the position of the item in the grid. You can also make use of the grid column and grid row shorthand for the same purpose. Values can be a grid line number or the number of columns or rows the item has to span. Alright, for the final set of properties, let's take a look at aligning items within a cell. Earlier in the video, we had a look at justify items, align items, and place items, which apply to every item in the container. However, if you want alignment for one single item, you make use of justify self, align self, and place self. Let's look at an example. On item 2, I'm going to set justify self stretch. Now this is the default value. So when I refresh the browser, you're not going to see any change. However, if I set it to start, refresh, you can see the item is pushed to the start of the row axis. Set it to end, refresh, and the item is at the end of the row axis. Set it to center, and the item is center aligned along the row axis. Similarly, we have align self for alignment along the column axis. The default value is stretch. When I refresh, you can see the item stretches from top to bottom. There is no change. If I set it to start, refresh, it is pushed to the top of the column axis. Set it to end, it is pushed to the bottom. Set it to center, and it is center aligned along the column axis. Now you can combine both justify self and align self into one place self shorthand property. So comment out the two properties and specify place self. First, we specify align self property value. So let's push it to the top using start. And then the justify self property value. Let's push it to the right using end. Refresh. And you can see the item is placed at the top right. You can also set one value, in which case it will be applied to both the properties. If I set it to center, refresh, you can see the item is center aligned both horizontally and vertically. So for alignment of an item within the cell, you have justify self for variation along the row axis, align self for variation along the column axis, and place self, which is a shorthand for both. The possible values are start, end, center, and stretch, which is the default value. Alright, with that, we wind up with the different properties that are part of the grid module. And in doing so, we have come to the end of this crash course on CSS Grid. I hope the video has given you an idea of how to lay out elements with CSS using the grid module. If you have enjoyed the video, please do leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more content on web development. I'll see you in the next video, which is a crash course on the fundamentals of JavaScript.